Hi AP Psychology students, welcome back. Today we are going to be talking about the brain, right? So we're moving from talking about neurons and neurotransmitters to the larger organ of the brain. And this fits with College Board Learning Objective, explain how the structures and functions of the brain apply to behavior and mental processes. We are going to get to this objective by answering the following questions. So how is the brain structured for different types of functions? And 2, what brain parts are responsible for different behaviors and mental processes? Now, just a note that there's a lot more brain parts that we're not going to talk about today, right? So we're going to go over some of the major brain parts that control very important parts of the behavior and mental processes that you do on a daily basis. But the brain is a much more complicated organism or organ than we would be able to explain in this short video. So when we think about the brain, it's divided into 3 basic divisions. So the first one is that hindbrain. So the hindbrain is going to be the oldest part of the brain. And these brain structures are responsible for our vital life functions: sleep, arousal, heartbeat, breathing, coordination, etc. Then we have the midbrain, and this is at the top of the brainstem and connects the hindbrain and the forebrain. And finally, we've got the forebrain. So the forebrain is made up largely of that cerebral cortex. It's what we think of maybe when we think of a brain, like the gray squiggly stuff. It has a few other major parts in addition to the cerebral cortex, and it is responsible for kind of the most cognitive, complex functions that we do as human beings. It's responsible for all of our sensory perception and for voluntary movement. So we're going to start by talking about the back of the brain and move all the way to the front of the brain. So first is the hindbrain, right? As you can see in this picture, the hindbrain is made up of 3 parts that you need to know. So the brainstem, the reticular activation system, and the cerebellum, right? And those 3 parts are all shown here. Well, 2 out of the 3 parts. So we have the cerebellum, and then we have the brainstem shown right here. So the brainstem is the innermost region of our brain, connecting both the spinal cord to the upper regions, right? So the spinal cord just becomes the brainstem. The brainstem consists of 2 major parts, the medulla and the pons. You guys are responsible for knowing what the medulla does. So the medulla, as you'll see right here, often referred to as the medulla oblongata, it is responsible for your heartbeat and breathing. Then we have this network of nerves called the reticular activating system, and this is not so much in one particular part, but it is kind of a network of parts or a network of nerves, and it's about the width of a pencil, and it's inside the brainstem, as you can see here, illustrated with this kind of like blue, light blue piece, and then it flows to areas all over the brain, and it's really responsible for 2 major things. So one, it is connected to our alertness and our arousal. So if we're asleep or if we're awake, and they find some connection to it with dreaming as well. Second, it is responsible for filtering incoming information. So it's responsible for learning to figure out like what sounds you pay attention to and what sounds you ignore, what things you like, visuals you pay attention to and what visuals you ignore, what touches you pay attention to and what touches you ignore. A study they did with this is like they found that parents like sometimes can ignore very loud sounds like trains or fireworks or etc. Like they can sleep through them, but if a baby cries, which maybe isn't as loud in the other room, they wake up, right? And this is because their reticular activating system has decided that those a train going by or fireworks, they can ignore that, but a baby needs their help, and so it wakes them up and tells them to respond. The next part of our hindbrain is the cerebellum. So the cerebellum is this little structure at the back of the brainstem, and it looks like a little brain, right? Like it looks like a little brain behind the big brain. It's responsible for balance, coordination, fine motor movements, and what we've talked about earlier in the memory unit for some of our procedural memories, our memories of how to do things, our memories of how to move, right? So that fits with the rest of its functions. Okay, so now we're going to move into the forebrain, right? So we talked about the hindbrain, the midbrain just connects the 2, and the forebrain. So the forebrain has 3 parts that you need to know about: the limbic system, the corpus callosum, and the lobes of the brain. So the limbic system. The limbic system is still inside the brain. It's a neural system. It's mostly in the forebrain. It's responsible for emotions and memories and drives. And really it's got 5 main parts. So the limbic system is pretty complex. If you take a look at this diagram over here, you will see that this is actually the front. So the view has switched, right? You can see the cerebellum in the back here. And inside we have a whole bunch of different parts: amygdala, hypothalamus, hippocampus, thalamus, and pituitary gland that all make up the limbic system. So we're going to start with the amygdala. The amygdala is this pea-shaped yellow part right here, right? And it is responsible for aggression and fear, right? And then we have the hippocampus, which is illustrated by the blue structure right here. And this, again, we've learned about it before with the memory unit, is responsible for forming conscious, explicit memories. All right, the next two that we have is the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus is this small little part right here, and it's really responsible for a lot of our drives as human beings. So hunger, thirst, body temperature, sexual behavior. The little mnemonic that I always tell students is that the hypothalamus is responsible for the 4 F's: feeding, fighting, fleeing, and making love. And then we have our reward centers. So we have found that some of the reward centers that activate on that dopamine, that make us want to do things, that make things addictive, that make things pleasurable, are in the hypothalamus. It's also the connection between the nervous and the endocrine system, right? So how does it connect? The hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland is the master gland, right? And it then communicates and controls with all the other glands. So, and then also the pituitary gland does have its own hormones that it releases. It releases HGH, so human growth hormone, and oxytocin, which is it's called the cuddle hormone. So it's released during labor for women to make the uterus contract. During breastfeeding, it's released during orgasm. So it helps promote kind of bonding between 2 different organisms. And then we've got the thalamus. So the thalamus sits on top of the brainstem, but technically it's a part of the limbic system and not part of the brainstem. So the thalamus is responsible for all the sensory control and relay. So senses go in, and then it routes them to the correct place that they need to go within other parts of the brain. So if this is a picture of what it looks like on top of the brainstem, right? You see right here. And then this picture shows it kind of within the context of the larger brain and all the other parts of the limbic system that we've discussed. Okay, so we've talked about the hindbrain, the brainstem, the cerebellum, the inside, the limbic system, and now we're all the way to the top of the brain, and this is where we see the lobes of the cerebral cortex, right? So the cortex itself is divided into 2 hemispheres, as you can see illustrated by the photo here, and those hemispheres are connected and communicate through a structure called the corpus callosum. So the corpus callosum is responsible for the hemispheric communication. Now, each of the 4 lobes that we're going to talk about all are represented in each hemisphere. So you've got a right frontal lobe and a left frontal lobe, right? And remember that each of these lobes connects the opposite side of the body. So the right frontal or the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body, and the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body. We're going to spend some more time about these hemispheres and the communication differences in an upcoming video. So what you see here are these 4 lobes that I mentioned. So we've got the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal. And each of those 4 lobes is in the right and the left hemisphere, and they each have specific functions that they are responsible for. So the frontal lobe, as seen here in the blue, it is it's like 1/3 of the whole cortex. So it's a big chunk, and it's responsible for a lot of really important things that make us humans. So critical thinking, morality, judgment, decision making, speech, right? The ability to talk, executive control functions. So planning, decision making, those are all in the frontal lobe. Now, there's 2 specific parts of that big, huge frontal lobe that you need to know. So the first is the prefrontal cortex, and this is really just the front of the frontal lobe. So if you take a look at this picture, remember the view has switched. So the front is on this side, right? But it's still the blue. So the frontal lobe is all of the blue, and the prefrontal cortex is this section in the front of the frontal lobe. And it's primarily responsible for all the planning, decision-making, executive functioning behaviors that humans have. The motor cortex, also located within the frontal lobe, is responsible for voluntary movement. So every single part of your body, right? Your fingers, your ankle, your wrist, your elbow, your shoulder, all the way down, head, shoulders, knees, and toes, it is all mapped out on that motor cortex. And every single part has specific motor neurons that talk to it, so that it lights up when you move your hand, a different part lights up than when you move your elbow, then lights up when you move your mouth, right? And as you can see, again, this diagram flipped again. So just always pay attention to where the cerebellum is to kind of help in the brainstem to help you figure out what's the front and the back in different pictures. All All right, the next two lobes we're going to talk about are the temporal lobe and the occipital lobe. So the temporal lobe is illustrated here in green, right? It is right by the temples or your ears, right behind your ears, and it is responsible for hearing, language, and smell. And then we have the occipital lobe, which is in the back. So we talk about your eyes in the back of your head. They actually are in the back of the brain, the part that controls vision. And so the occipital lobe is in the back. And it's illustrated with the pink here in our diagram. Now, the parietal lobe is the yellow, right? It's the last lobe, and it is responsible for our sensations of touch and body position. Now, when I say body position, what I mean is like, what direction are you facing? How close are you standing to somebody? How do you walk, like in a kind of straight line and not bump into things? Like what's over here in space and what's over there in space. So it's very much figuring out how you are in the space of a chair, like how to sit in the middle of the chair, that kind of thing, and like what position your body is compared to the world around you. Now, when it comes to touch, there is a very specific part of the brain that you need to know for touch, and this is the somatosensory cortex. So this is shown by the dark pink in this picture, right? So you have the motor cortex and the sensory cortex, and they actually are back to back. So the motor cortex, it's not shown in this picture, but it would be right here. It would be this chunk right here, and the sensory cortex is this dark purple chunk right there, right? And that's responsible for our sense of touch. And it works the same thing. So head, shoulders, knees, and toes, everywhere where you can feel a sensation is laid out in that sensory cortex. And for example, when you touch your arm, a different part, or hand, a different part lights up than if you touch your knee or if you touch your cheek, right? So that was a really quick overview of the major parts of the brain that you have to know. Make sure that you can answer these essential questions. And remember, that's all for now, AP Psychos, and psychology is flippin' awesome.